Hey everybody! In this video, I am putting my money where my mouth is. Let me back up a little bit. A few months ago, I ranked Shadow of the Erdtree bosses, but I refused to include Radahn in my rankings. I said the following at the time. I'm not going to rank Radahn. No other boss would move in the rankings so much with so few tweaks. Likewise, I made another video about Radahn in which I speculated that with a few modifications, Radahn's standing in my book would vault to higher echelons, and I was reticent to judge him with any finality because the fixes I hoped for seemed like ones that might actually get implemented. And indeed, for the most part, those fixes materialized when From Software nerfed Radahn a few months ago. The biggest change, of course, was made to the triple slash to make it rollable. They also cleared some visual clutter, improved performance, and increased cooldown time in between attacks. This latter especially made a great variety of playstyles much more viable, and I showcased an example in my lightning attack fight against Radahn. So I think it's time for me to re-rank Shadow of the Erdtree bosses, this time taking Radahn into account, and also adding some new reflections based on subsequent playthroughs. In last place, it's Metyr. Metyr isn't a bad boss, but she suffers from mediocrity amid a lineup of much more formidable contenders. On the plus side, Metyr's lore is excellent, and the aesthetics are pretty cool. She looks like an absolute freak, which I love, and her magic attacks often mirror cosmological phenomena that speak to a thoughtful alignment of story and mechanics. But she does have a number of deficiencies. The most obvious and egregious is the laser sweep attack, the first pass of which appears to be genuinely undodgeable without the use of an Ash of War like Raptors of the Mist. As I've said before, while a single move like this isn't a huge deal on its face, I'm philosophically opposed to the incorporation of any moves that can't be evaded through skill and practice, so I've got to automatically knock a lot of points off for this. There are some more often minor mechanical defects like the aerial spin attack, which has a janky hitbox that I find inconsistent and generally just kind of unreasonably large. It's a fight that's nothing to write home about, but I really don't mind it at all, and I don't think it should be hated on, but it does have to take us the spot at the bottom of the list here. Alright, in 10th place, it's the Putrescent Knight. The Putrescent Knight isn't a bad fight by any means at all, but it's dipped in my rankings over the last few months as I've come to appreciate Commander Gaius and other bosses a lot more. In fact, I made a video about my appreciation for Gaius, but as for Putrescent Knight, the main demerit he has is his boxy shape and a lack of fluidity in his movements. There's just a certain lack of grace and nimbleness that better, more agile bosses have. When you can engage with him, though, it's a lot of fun. So most of these issues are more stylistic than mechanical, but they can rise to the mechanical level when the angle of his movement makes combat engagement difficult, i.e. he flits away, or your sword just winds up missing him if it's a medium or short-length sword, just because of the angles and his kind of arc of movement. On the plus side, his Wombo combo is extremely cool, although on my PC it consistently caused frame dropping issues. The aesthetics are gorgeous, the rich, velvety purple of St. Trina carpets an otherwise eerie and cavernous arena. The knight himself gives off major Hollow Knight vibes, in my opinion, and no one can convince me that there isn't an intentional homage woven in there. So too is there with his weapon, this time a pretty obvious reference to both the Orphan of Kos and, to a certain extent, the Elden Beast. As above, so below, they say. The Putrescent Knight utilizes branching combos that require fairly precise pattern recognition to ensure proper differentiation of your responses, a skill that will serve you well throughout the DLC and which I will mention on more than one occasion in the rest of this video. He moves around quite a bit, and like I alluded to, it can occasionally tip towards the excessive side of the spectrum, but it's nothing really offensive. Overall, I think he's a great boss, but there are stronger contenders ahead of him. I'm giving the 9th place spot to Shadow Tree Avatar. I really enjoy the Sunflower. After fighting so many absolutely horseshit flower enemies in the base game of Elden Ring, this genuinely interesting and fun fight was a breath of fresh air, which is ironic given the stagnant miasma in which we find it. The decrepitude of the Shadow Tree avatar mimics that which it stands in for, so the environmental storytelling here is quite on point. Thorns and branch and body slams are the mainstays of this fight, but we get shades of the Erdtree avatar bosses in the holy projectiles as well. These projectiles, interestingly, are a sort of metonymy for the fight as a whole, and its differences from the Erdtree avatar bosses, as they're amped up from the projectiles the base game avatars use. In the base game, you can simply outrun these projectiles, but the ones here are much more intense, long, and complex, coming in multiple waves and requiring more aggressive evasion. It's yet another brilliant irony that the Shadow Tree avatar is simultaneously much sicker and much more robust than its non-accursed counterparts. The fight itself is remarkable for featuring a large enemy for which the camera doesn't actively work against you, a simple yet scarce luxury in From Software games. The charge attack looks like a dog rubbing its butt against a carpet, which I find weirdly endearing, and the option to end each phase with a critical hit that will in turn hack off a chunk of health in the next phase is a unique mechanic that I really liked. It's not the most memorable boss in the world, but it's one I absolutely look forward to on subsequent playthroughs. Alright, next up it's Romina, Saint of the Bud. Romina is a phenomenal fight, but she's been slighted by the developers. She deserves better than she's gotten, given that she's the penultimate boss. A greater sense of anticipation and gravitas should have been cultivated throughout the level. She certainly should have had a cutscene with dialogue to give us more context and to engender an epicness appropriate to the second-to-last boss. Nonetheless, what we do have is still great, although perfect she is not. In my opinion, she has the best OST in the DLC. Romina has a relatively limited moveset, but she compensates for this with the complexity of the moves that she does have. Her combos utilize body parts and weapon attacks, and these unconventional hitboxes chained together in quick succession demand problem-solving and experimentation. Her aerial spin features another one of those hitbox exploitations, allowing you to dodge once despite appearing to require a number of dodges. The little scintillations of rot butterflies are such a great touch, adding a visual beauty to the fight that partially cushions the eye from the absolute monstrosity that we're up against. It also links her securely to the lore, which is often signposted through the use of different species of butterflies. Romina has a few strikes against her. Her hitboxes are a bit more opaque than an optimally polished version of this fight might be, and it's sometimes confusing why you take damage in such inconsistent ways. Romina also suffers from a metier problem in that her phase transition is unacceptably bad. It's both untelegraphed and undodgeable at close range. You cannot escape in time if you're near her once it begins, and you have no sign that tells you that it's about to begin, so you can't get away, and you're screwed if you get caught. The only way to avoid damage here is to time a critical hit roughly near the center of the health bar, or to start attacking from range when you start approaching the mid-health point. It doesn't ruin the fight for me because of these options, but much like with Metier, this kind of move is really anti-player, and I think we should be opposed as a community to their incorporation in future boss fights. Divine Dancing Lion comes in 7th. This is another fight that's moved since my initial rankings. Back then, I actually had him higher on my list, edging out Rolana, which in retrospect was a completely bananas opinion on my part. Don't get me wrong, I still really enjoy him, but he has more mechanical defects than Rolana does, for sure. In the pro column, we can start with his cutscene. It's likely the first you'll encounter in the DLC, and it does its job as the inaugural cinematic admirably. When the fight begins, the top-notch music kicks in, gesturing towards the heritage from which From Software clearly took inspiration here. Like a good number of bosses in this DLC, the lion has an ability to jolt, jerk, and lumber, while also gliding and flitting and slicing through the air with wispy acrobatics. His often counterintuitive timings straddle the line between a challenge and a nuisance, rarely veering from the former into the latter. There are certain head slam combos that I think are a little too ungainly, and the camera dynamics are not amazing in this fight, as it's not uncommon to find yourself wedged into the corner of the arena looking at unintelligible visual garbage. I've gone back and forth on how I feel about the lightning phase. I do appreciate the way it unveils itself slowly to be much more tameable than it appears at first blush. I've said for years and from my very first video on this channel that what I love most about soft fights is the sort of dawning cognitive clarity that comes with repeat attempts. Initially, all you see is a whirl of illegible chaos that you can't imagine ever processing, but slowly your brain begins to comprehend it until it almost feels like the fight is moving slower than it was the first time you experienced it. And the same happened as I continuously beat my head against the lightning phase. When I realized that a constant state of backward motion would not only put you out of range of the delayed explosions, but would also open up counterattack windows, it really clicked for me. Now, when I made my first ranking video, I kind of left it here and celebrated that, but I've replayed him a bunch of times, and I've actually tempered my excitement a little bit. What I said about this phase being tameable is still true for sure, but I now think that the dodging to attack ratio in the lightning phase is excessively lopsided in favor of evasion, and a slightly nerfed version of the lightning phase would improve the fight quite a bit, in my opinion. In 6th place, it's Commander Gaius, whom I initially ranked in last place, so quite a turnaround here. I just made an entire video about him, so I don't want to tax your attention with too much redundancy. You can check that video out if you want a more in-depth explanation of my thoughts. In brief, I initially dinged him for being boxy and having awkward camera dynamics that force you into cramped or counterintuitive paths, but I've gained a greater appreciation for him in recent playthroughs. First, at least if you light roll, his initial charge attack isn't nearly as bad to deal with as the internet discourse would suggest. I understand that that's not the case on medium roll, but I can really only speak to how I play the game, so it's not really been a problem for me. Second, even though I find mounted bosses typically awkward and cumbersome in general, I've found this to be less true of Gaius than bosses like Putrescent Knight and the Knight's Cavalry. Post-evasion positioning in the Gaius fight is different than and less flexible than in humanoid fights, but at least in Gaius's case, it's quite consistent, allowing you to learn, predict, and master your trajectories of motion and plan your attacks accordingly. Perhaps my favorite part of Gaius's design is that his anti-spamming maneuvers also present opportunities for strategic utilization to your own advantage. If you move to his rear, he quite often discharges a rapid backward kick. This is clearly designed to prohibit Gaius from becoming a booty boss. But knowing that this attack is almost inevitable, you can actually aim for his ass, immediately dodge inward, and end up right by his head for a nice counterattack that deals heavy physical damage and posture damage. So yeah, I like him a lot more now than I used to, and he's earned this kind of middle of the pack status. Radahn comes in 5th for me. I was traumatized by her for a while because the first time I fought her, I was simultaneously doing my no-hit run for Shadow of the Erdtree, and I found her to be an absolute nightmare to no-hit, given how fast some of her moves are. But playing more times without worrying about taking a bit of damage here and there, she really shines. Radahn takes the aesthetics and aggression of Pontiff Sullivan and injects them with a more sensitive AI and the kaleidoscopic combo trees of Elden Ring. She offers ample opportunities for jumping and strafing, and her branching combos that begin similarly spur the player to develop strategies for either differentiating on the fly or innovating responses that work for multiple endings. Her responses to your positioning can vary more than, say, Gaius's do, but they don't vary so much that they feel random or unwieldy. This balance allows the fight to feel fresh and frenetic each time without devolving into distasteful chaos. The carrion sword, slash, and swipe move is an absolute joy to dodge, and the addition of fire and magic in Phase 2 is visually and mechanically thrilling. On the negative side, her magic phalanx attack can sometimes overlap with the magic sword slam, and the timing of this makes it impossible to not take damage. This rarely happens, so it's not a huge deal, But on the flip side, it should also be easy enough for the developers to make sure it never happens. Rolana also has a Romina problem in that her lack of a cutscene and dialogue seems pretty inexplicable and frankly unbecoming of someone so important and so epic. We should not have to wait until we get her armor at Round Table Hold after she's already dead to learn that she's not just a Carian princess, but actually Renala's sister. In fourth place, it's Midra, an absolute masterpiece that feels lifted directly out of Dark Souls 3. Getting into the top echelon, I have entire videos devoted to these bosses, so I don't want to tread on already well-trodden ground, and I'll keep it brief. Midra isn't the most complicated boss, but he's the one that most recreates that feeling of a carefully choreographed dance that distinguishes the Dark Souls series that some of us older fans of the franchise love so much. I've said since the beginning of my channel, in videos as old as my Twin Princes analysis, that for me, complexity isn't the only yardstick of a fight's merit. It's one of them, but not the only. If it is for you, that's fine, but it's not for me. I use words like fluidity and choreography and martial dance a lot in my videos because these are the qualities that elevate many of From Software's boss fights to a graphical artistry in which you're not merely a spectator, but an active participant. Midra really nails this. He has a core set of moves around which he pins a number of variations, thus maintaining a dance-like tempo with engaging and fun ornamentations. Midra is a medium-speed boss featuring some moves that require double dodging at the extreme end of the spectrum, but overall maintaining a pace that allows for more mental equilibrium than a fight like, for example, Rolana does. He offers a number of excellent opportunities for counterattacks, and I was able to use the Poison Flower Blooms twice Ash of War on a great katana in this fight to both close distance and inflict heavy poise damage. He also presents a high degree of player customization, ripe with opportunities for non-rolling evasion. Crouching beneath his aerial spin attack may just be the single most satisfying defensive spectacle in the entire game. Set to a dope soundtrack, backlit with the Frenzied Flames integration of bright and lurid hues of orange, red, and yellow, this fight is a slam dunk all the way. And now the moment we've all been waiting for, we come to it, Radahn. I deliberated for a while, but I'm gonna drop Promised Consort Radahn into slot number 3 after the nerf. Check out my Can Radahn Become S tier video for a fuller explanation of what was wrong with him prior to the nerf, but here's a synopsis. The triple slash was functionally undodgeable prior to the nerf, and it was essentially unleashed with such speed as to be untelegraphed as well. This deficit both practically guaranteed you'd take damage, and it also forced you into a state of leftward motion, because the only way to have a sliver of a chance of dodging it was to be on his left. You'd wind up then carrying this leftward motion over into phase 2, because the holy damage requires you to move away from the initial site of evasion in phase 2, so the most natural maneuver was just to maintain this directionality from phase 1 to 2. This wound up imposing a mechanical monotony that severely diminished improvisation and experimentation. After the nerf, this has changed. I think the fix is really well balanced. It's still actually a bit tricky to dodge the triple slash, but it's eminently fair for a difficult boss, in my opinion, striking, like I said, the chord of extreme difficulty rather than a giant middle finger to the player. With this fix, you also find yourself free to change up your roll directionality, making it so much more enjoyable. The increased cooldown windows got a bunch of complaints in the comments on my post-nerf no-hit video of Radahn, but I just disagree that this is a problem. Yeah, it makes the fight fractionally easier, but beforehand, he resumed attack combos so quickly that anything but light, dexterous playstyles was not feasible. Personally, I'm a dex scrub, so it wasn't like this was a huge issue for me, as that's how I play the game anyway, but really the whole point of letting players choose strength builds or magic builds or whatever is that these builds are supposed to be just as viable as the builds that I like. And they weren't before, and now they are. This fight might feature the most diverse range of evasive maneuvers of the whole roster, with running and jumping liberally integrated into the necessary defense. I'm still going to ding him a bit for some janky inconsistencies. Your ability to dodge the clone attacks is often contingent on where you happen to be in the arena when he begins them, and given how much running you have to do, it's not uncommon to find yourself sandwiched against a wall and thus SOL. But overall, the nerf fixed nearly everything I disliked about the fight, and while it's not my absolute favorite in the game, I do think it's now solidly S tier. I went back and forth about this, but at the end of the day, if I ask myself which fight I just straight up enjoy more, I have to give it to Bale over Radahn. I don't know, man, I just love this fight. It's an absolute blast for me every time I step back into the arena. My single most viewed video on this channel is my FromSoft Dragon comparison video, and that's where I dive into the details, so check that out if you haven't seen it. But for those who haven't seen it, he's now my favorite dragon, just slightly edging out my previous fave, Dark Eater Midir. While I adore Midir, Bale is able to recapture Midir's ferocity, adopting certain moves from him that happen to be the best in Midir's catalog. His attack patterns draw from Dark Souls 3 as a whole, though, not just Midir. He slaloms between heavy and light, lumbering and swift, with a slick grace that makes these dichotomies mesh rather than feel haphazardly slapped together like they so easily could have. In this sense, he's reminiscent, as I said in my Dark Souls 4 video, of Dragonslayer armor, but what I neglected to mention in that video is that he's perhaps even more reminiscent of Champion Gundyr in this sense, whose arrhythmic but smooth motion maps onto Bale's various wing swipes and tail swings. This creates an uneven tempo that looks visually disarming and feels fresh and engaging. The arena is incorporated to the perfect extent, with pillars of electricity and pools of exploding lava in Phase 2, requiring some deliberate footwork without ever devolving into an overwhelming frenzy. Phase 2 is visually stunning, with the lightning fire some of the most cinematic in the entire franchise. His aerial fire strafe looks cool beyond belief, and his massive explosion takes Placiduous axes and perfects it in every way. There are some downsides that still haven't been patched, which I find utterly bewildering, and I'm still holding out hope that they will actually do something about them. Doesn't look good, though. The principle of which is the janky camera. Logging on is overall better than it is in a lot of dragon fights, but that is a pathetically low bar, and what we have is still not great. But everything else is so great that it overcomes this deficit, which speaks to the fight's accomplishment, because I usually lop off a ton of points for crappy camera dynamics. And claiming the gold, no shocker here, it's Messmer. Another boss I've made a whole video about. I've somehow come to appreciate him even more since my initial ranking. Messmer is one of those fights you know right away is a masterpiece, but not all of those fights age well. This one emphatically does. Visually, they pulled off a remarkable feat, as his aesthetics and ensemble could easily have descended into camp, but Messmer never does. His cutscene is fantastic, although the soundtrack leaves a lot to be desired in my opinion. The mechanics really shine here, though. Messmer has very few tools in Phase 1, but through the genius of design, he's able to create a vast library of moves and combos with those tools. Branching combos force close, sustained attention, but the satisfaction of mastering their subtle cues is accordingly immense. Fire spins, spear thrusts, and the breathtaking Messmer's assault combo marry aesthetics and technically sophisticated mechanics. The fight is dynamic, faster than Midra, but still very much in the dance choreography vein that defines him. Phase 2's genius is that it introduces an entirely new set of visuals that makes it feel like a clearly distinct transformation. But nonetheless, it still feels like the same fight as Phase 1 because the surface differences belie a mechanical unity running throughout the game design in this fight. The snake's hitboxes are designed perfectly, such that even though they're large and bulky, they're perfectly natural to dodge. They have the same smooth but slightly arrhythmic timings as Phase 1. When you couple that with some carried over moves from the first phase, as I said, you have a second phase that looks 100% different but also feels 100% the same mechanically and cognitively. Awesome to take in, marvelous to play, Mesmer checks all of the boxes, and his place at the peak of this list is well earned. So that's my updated ranking of Shadow of the Erdtree bosses. Let me know your rankings now that Radahn's been nerfed and or now that you've played a few times in the comments below, and as always, thank you very much for watching.